That's
That's between husband and wife. We don't want to get into that.
Because that was a very bizarre comment.
Let's, there are children watching this.
Yes, really.
The children gotta have a sense of humor now.
Well, let's just hope the children have a sense of humor.
Thirsty.
So are we going to continue 8 o'clock from now on?
Well, for the time being, we're hoping that we can move it back to Saturday morning soon.
I like that.
But I don't think that's happening immediately. It's under discussion, and the answer is not yet.
So where would they have it? Where is there a room that would allow?
Well, we'd probably do it in a room where they could set up equipment so that at least people at home could listen in.
Oh, yeah, that's true too, yes.
Which, I mean, that would be the ideal. I don't think we could manage a full Zoom conversation. I would not want to do that, but we could at least have it set up so that people could listen in.
So
Some people are good listeners,
Right now, on an average Saturday morning, do you have any idea how many people are participating in chapel services via Zoom? Do you have any idea?
You mean, are you talking about the Museum Minyan Zoom service?
Right.
Oh, that I would guess is probably around 30 people.
Oh, really?
Although, I mean, Ashley might know better figures than I do, but as far as the live stream of the chapel service and the sanctuary service, there are many more people watching that.
Interesting.
Well,
So if we move the class back to Saturday,
Mhm.
and there are still people who would like to participate but don't feel that they can come yet, then we will probably just live stream the class.
Mhm.
Rabbi,
Yes, Del.
while we were at Bris Shalom after Harvey, we just did the class in the room we used for services.
Which we could do. It's a little large for a class, but we could do that, and we might need to if that was the only way to live stream.
If nobody's in Stein Hall, could actually probably do it there.
That's possible. Probably a more difficult setup. Apparently, for some reason, the mechanics of it are not as simple in Stein Hall, because I mean, the equipment is there in the Barg and in Friedman Levitt.
Right. Well, in order for it to work in Stein Hall and be able to be streamed, Andy would have to put in the same stuff that was used when we streamed out of Righteous Hall those few times.
Yes, which is complicated. I mean, they can't even go in there until 5 o'clock on Friday. So it's a royal pain.
And the Stein Hall with the number, well, actually Stein Hall with the number of people we've had at the Saturday morning Torah studies, we could all sit in there, just everybody sit there and not even have our masks on and be properly socially distanced.
Yeah, social distancing for our class in any of these places would not be difficult. Yeah. So let's go to our material for tonight. And of course, Tazria-Metzora is, particularly difficult material because there's all this stuff about impurity and disease, and rabbis typically find it their least favorite week to preach. So, usually if you have 3 rabbis, the youngest one gets to preach that week. Guess who's preaching in the sanctuary in the chapel this week? So I'll give you a hint. It's not Rabbi Strauss and it's not Rabbi Morgan. So anyway, there are, however, some fascinating topics that come out of the material in Tazria-Metzora. And one of them is this piece about the house that has a disease, the house that is afflicted with tzara'at. Right? So, what the tzara'at actually is, it requires some speculation, because the Torah doesn't tell you. I mean, all it really tells you that it is a skin disease. It is sometimes translated as leprosy, but it is not leprosy. Scholars are pretty much clear about that. But the house that has this disease, well, what is it? We don't know for sure. Gersonides here says that this tzara'at, it's like a mold. Right? It's caused by damp. Right? And, that can happen anywhere. Right? You'd think it wouldn't happen too much in the desert, but can happen. Right? And tzara'at has stages that it can go through. Right? So what does the Midrash have to say about the stages of tzara'at? That they are similar to the plagues, which gradually became stronger and were a warning to the Egyptians. Okay? Okay? So tzara'at also has, it is certainly a plague of one kind or another. And first, it comes to the house. And if people improve, let's leave aside the question for a moment of what it means to improve. If they improve, well and good. If not, the stones of the house have to be removed. And then after that, the next stage is demolition. And then there's the clothing, right? So it suggests that the tzara'at is something you can do something about. Right? Now, there are many midrashim that suggest that tzara'at is like a compression of the words motzi shem ra, which means one who gossips, one who brings forth an evil tongue. Right? And so, gossip is frequently identified as the thing for which people are being punished. But that's not universally agreed upon. Here we see another midrash. Why do people get tzara'at on their homes? Well, because they're deceptive. It says a man is asked, lend me some grain. He says, I have none. A woman is asked for a winnow or a sieve and says, I have none. So what does God do? Knowing that these people are lying through their teeth, he brings this plague upon the house, and then the house, they have to empty it. And everyone will see what they own. Right? So here, it's a punishment for fraud of a sort, and also for just the general ungenerosity that goes along with such cases. Right? So tzara'at in these things is framed as a punishment for some kind of immorality. Right? Yes, Ronnie.
So was this ever done? Were they literally?
Well, we're coming up to that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, Jerry.
You know the Yiddish word tourist, how does that fit into this?
Very well, thank you. Anybody who's got tzara'at in one form or another, even if it's just the walls of their house, that's a tzuris.
Right. So is that where the Yiddish word comes from?
It comes from the Hebrew, sarot, troubles. Tzuris is just a Yiddish bastardization of that.
Okay.
Right? That not really related to the word Metzora, but thematically it could be. Right? All right. So there are those who say this is a punishment for some kind of immorality. Not everybody agrees with that. Look at this here teaching from the Talmud. It says the afflicted house never was and never will be. In other words, this doesn't exist. New, so why is it written? Why is it included in the Torah? So that we might examine it and receive a reward for doing so. Right? In other words, whatever Torah you study is a plus on your part. So occasionally, God includes things that you should just read them and learn about them, and you'll be rewarded for that, even though it doesn't have a practical application. And there are other laws which fit into that category. So for instance, Deuteronomy 21, what do you do with a rebellious son? Right? Someone who's gluttonous, who curses his parents. He's a real mamzer, right? So what happens? They take him before the elders. They tell him, he did thus and thus and thus, and they all take him out and stone him. Now, that sounds kind of harsh. You're talking about someone who's a young person whose mentality is probably not fully formed. So the rabbis say, lo haya velo nivra. There never was such a thing. And it's just so that you should see it in the Torah and study it and learn from it. Same thing in Deuteronomy 13 with the destruction of the idolatrous city. How many cities were there even in that time that were totally idolatrous, where, the whole city practiced idolatry?
I can think of two.
I'm sorry?
I can think of two a few generations earlier.
Well, yeah, but that was back in the time of Abraham and Lot, right?
Mhm.
Now, and certainly for those living later than the time of the Torah, you didn't have totally idolatrous cities. You probably even in the time when the Israelites were in Israel, had just conquered the land of Canaan, there were probably people who were not Jewish, but who weren't really attached to any other religion. It's like in every generation, there are people who say, yeah, It's a bunch of nonsense, right? So there too, there would never be such a thing as a totally idolatrous city. So why is it there? It's in the Torah, so you should study it and be rewarded for studying Torah. You know, God couldn't have put something else in the Torah that would have had a little more practical application. I don't know. But that's how the rabbis get around things that they just don't think are right or don't think they actually existed. No. I mean, they knew that the stoning of the rebellious son was a little over the top, right? It was a lot over the top. And they probably didn't have a clear handle on exactly what this tzara'at was. And some of them were probably not comfortable with the idea of, you know, disease being a punishment for immoral behavior, right? Because, I mean, even in the Talmud, we know that there were rabbis who didn't accept that. And so, yeah, you know, if something bad happens, what's the first thing you should do? What did I, you know, maybe I did something to deserve this. Maybe, you know, I failed to carry out something important, or I violated some important law. And maybe that's why this happened to me. But the rabbis were not very comfortable with carrying that any farther, if they were comfortable with that. Some of them were, but not all were comfortable even with that much. And so if they saw something that they just couldn't accept, they found a way to deal with it. So for instance, you know, it's a mitzvah in the Torah to destroy all the Amalekites, right? That just, you know, you saw what happened with Samuel and King Saul. A few weeks ago in the Haftarah, the, you know, Saul spares King Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And the prophet Samuel said, "You did what?" You had instructions, right? You were supposed to kill every living thing, right? You were supposed to kill all of them. And the cattle, right? Them too, while you're at it.
Well, we can go back a few generations to in the Torah where
In the what?
in the Torah where the warriors came back and they brought the women and the children
Yes.
after a battle, and Moses chastised them all.
Yes. But you know, this concerns the Amalekites, about whom there was a specific mitzvah in the Torah, right? So that's why I mentioned this particular thing. So what did the rabbis in the Talmud say about that? They said that can't apply anymore because there is no more pure Amalekite nations. All the nations have been intermarried and jumbled up, and so there's no more pure Amalekites. Maybe you got somebody who's 1/4 Amalekite, right? That's how we dealt with the things that were unacceptable to the rabbis, right? And that's, you know, what happens here in the opinion of the rabbis of the Talmud, that the afflicted house never was and never will be. Okay. Now, let's take a look at this piece from the 16th century mystic, Moshe Alshich. Right? And what does he have to say about this? He agrees with the Talmud. The plague never existed, but the laws, they have an important purpose. They teach us to watch carefully for any small misdeed. A disease can begin with very small signs and be stopped if it's noticed in the early stages. Moral decay, same thing. If you counter it at first sight, then you can keep it from spreading. Otherwise, all the affected parts may have to be eradicated before the society can be made healthy. And he quotes from Jeremiah, "See, I appoint you this day over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and pull down, to destroy and overthrow. And after that, finally, to build and to plant." Okay. So I think this is consistent with the thinking of the Talmudic rabbis earlier, that they say that it never was and never will be, but it's also kind of a suggestion to us that if we think of it in moral terms, then we should treat moral problems as the kinds of things that we have to eradicate as soon and as thoroughly as possible. Okay? So, comments or questions up to here? All right. Now, again, some people suggest that Sara'at was a natural phenomenon. Some suggest associated it with gossip and slander or stinginess. Right? The Talmud says it's metaphorical, right? So if you're going to treat it as a metaphor, and if you're going to follow the teaching of Alshich, at what point are we prepared to be concerned about small imperfections, right? What are the signs of decay in our society or in our Jewish community that should concern us? Anyone have a thought on that?
General immorality.
I'm sorry?
General immorality.
General immorality. But you don't have a specific beef.
Not that I can think of right now.
Uh-huh. All right.
Okay.
Yes, Ronnie.
Lashon Hora.
Lashon Hora. Well, that's the classic association with Metzora, right? Lashon Hora, gossiping, telling tales about people, even if they're true. Right?
Well, if it's true, you're just passing the news.
Well, yeah, but sometimes passing the news is destructive also. I mean, so it's true, but who needs to know? Now, if it's something that, is a problem for the welfare of the community, that's one thing. But let's say that, Tevye and his wife Golda are fighting, and you overhear it, and then you tell the next door neighbor, I heard Golda and Tevye fighting, right? That's Lashon Hara. And it may have been true, but it's still not permitted to gossip about such things, because there's nothing, there's no threat to the community if Tevye and Golda are having an argument. Right? So it can be true, but it's still Lashon Hara. Right? And so, as the centuries went on, this became more and more of an issue in halachic writings. And right about the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, there was a teacher who was known as the Chafetz Chaim, who wrote a very lengthy book on the laws of permitted speech. So I think that, it became more and more understood how problematic it was for people to gossip, how much potential there is for sin in speech. Okay? And for that matter, if you look at the penitential prayers on Yom Kippur, and you look at that long, long list of sins, you'll see that a lot of them have to do with speech. So, yeah, that's a big one. Okay. Yes, Ronnie.
This made me think of an old, almost like a nursery rhyme, but sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, which is so not true.
Which is
Because
absolutely not true. Yeah,
that's what this is about, because words are very powerful and words can definitely hurt.
absolutely. So that's one reason why over time it's become more and more significant in discussion in Jewish law, to the point where you find, entire seminars devoted to the study of these laws and to, practical applications. Right? What kind of tale telling is permitted and to whom and about whom, right? And generally speaking, as Jewish law has evolved, not only is there more talk about this, but there's more prohibitions that have been issued about certain kinds of speech. And the Chafetz Chaim was a real pioneer in, putting together a whole volume on that. Yeah, Jerry?
The Chofetz Chaim Foundation, usually somewhere around Tisha B'Av, they really get big in the Orthodox, with videos and conferences. And that's all they study.
Yes. It's a very interesting project. I think that one of my friends in Kansas City who works in a Jewish institution had a sign on his desk, and I think he got it from the Chafetz Chaim Foundation, which said, this is a Lashon Hara free zone. Would that the synagogue could be that good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Never happened.
Well, there, always something to strive for, isn't there? There's only one place where sinless people are.
And that's
Right?
not on this earth.
Yeah, unless they're lying in the earth, right? So, we just have to keep working until we're done, or until we're finished. Let's put it that way. Yes, Ronnie.
Okay. This topic, this really gets me thinking, because when you talk about Lashon Hara, usually when I think about it, it's spreading something that is false or hurtful. Okay. But there's also, let's say you suspect that a child is being abused some way.
Yes.
Reporting it to the authorities without, where does that factor in? When you see something and you report it.
Yes. If you see it directly and you know for a fact that it's abuse, then you're obligated to report it. If you're not sure,
Right.
I would say go to someone with some expertise in that area, whether it be, someone at Jewish Family Service or to one of the rabbis. And
But that's not,
they'll tell you if you need to report it.
but that's not Lashon Hora then.
No, something that has to be reported for the good of the community or the good of an individual doesn't count as Lashon Hora, right? The example I gave, with Tevye and Golda, right? That's not abuse. That's just stuff that happens. I don't know too many couples who never had an argument, right? So big deal. It's, so you overheard it, it's none of your business anyway, right? And then to repeat it to somebody else, that's what you call chokhmah. Chokhmah literally means wisdom, but when you say it in that tone of voice, it's the opposite, right? Chokhmah. Or as your grandmother would have said, what a chochem. Right? Okay. So, laws of speech certainly are one area where we have to be concerned with small imperfections because we can cause big problems. Okay? And, so there we have to take appropriate countermeasures, which is to educate the community, to educate children, right? Now, when I was in religious school, there was never conversation about Lashon Hara, about gossiping. I never knew that gossiping was forbidden until I learned it in high school. By which time I had probably said a lot of things I shouldn't have. I was low on the social skills in any way, right? So, it just was all the worse for not knowing what was permitted and what was forbidden. But, I learned it probably when I was at a youth group convention, and that was a theme. And that was a revelation to me. I never thought about, obviously Judaism, I would have assumed that Judaism would never, want you to do harm to someone, but never thought about how specific Jewish law was in addressing this particular kind of harm, where it's very easy to rationalize saying things that, even that you say, but it's true, right? But to pass it on, that's forbidden, right? So, and they also talked about the exceptions to this, Ronnie. What if you know that somebody's being harmed, right? So then, we talked about, what should be done. And I understand it was a theme at a national convention of the youth group sometime in the 80s. So that was a little later. But what a good idea, right? To teach the leadership of your national youth group this whole very important set of laws, which have nothing to do with ritual particularly, right? But they're all about behavior and speech. And, the leadership gets the message, and then the message filters down to the rest of the membership.
Rabbi, what I think is the why people like to gossip is it makes them feel powerful.
Yes. Yes.
And that's a very good feeling.
Yeah. I know something about this person.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's also an ego management piece,
Mhm.
right? Why do I want to tell somebody about this? And this, the Chafetz Chaim also talks about that you have to be managing your ego well enough to where you think about that before you say something. Mm-hmm. So that's an important piece too.
Yeah.
Yes, Jerry?
Okay, so going back, there's a story of Miriam and what she said about Moses' wife. And what happened? Miriam got tzuras, right?
Yes.
So how's that all tied together to what we're learning? That was before, right?
So yeah, well, that's actually, it's later in the Torah. It's in Baha'alotecha.
Right.
I actually gave a sermon that week about Miriam, right? Because you remember what Miriam was gossiping about? It was Moses.
Who Moses' wife was, what color she was.
Yeah, basically, that's it. He had a Cushite wife. Right?
He married Jethro's daughter, right?
Well, we're not clear if this is the same woman or if it's another wife. Because it doesn't identify her by name.
But the question is, Miriam is a holy woman. Why was she saying those things? It shows an imperfection for all of us.
Yeah, well, but God isn't giving her any out.
Right.
So basically, this was a couple of weeks after the death of George Floyd, and so police brutality and racism were themes that were being talked about. So Del, you were probably there when I talked about this. Yeah, you wanted to say something, Del.
What I wanted to say is by Miriam saying about the Cushite woman, that's right down to blatant racism.
Yeah.
So we've got the Torah coming out against racism thousands of years ago.
Yes. And the other piece about that is that, this disease that God afflicts her with turns her skin white, right? Snow white. It's like God is saying to Miriam, you want white? I'll give you white.
Here's a dose of leprosy for you.
Yeah, if that's what it was, which, again, probably not, but Sarat, yes. Yeah. Other comments or questions before we go on? All right, so this tzaraat becomes kind of a stand-in for any serious illness that threatens us. And so the purification ritual is the next thing about this, because that's real important, right? When things are all right. So you know, there's all this stuff that the Kohen is supposed to take. Right? The live bird and the cedar wood and the crimson thread and the hyssop and the live bird and the blood of the bird slaughtered over the running water. Right? So, do you notice anything about the things that are put together here?
It seems very unkosher.
There's that too, yes.
I mean, you're taking one bird and you're shoving it in the blood of its same kind.
Uh-huh. So there's, you know, right there, of course, is life and death being kind of jammed together. Right? And so, yeah.
The running water is used for purification.
Yes, which, you know, is jammed together with this slaughtering. Okay. So there are opposites kind of being jammed together. That's very strange. Right? And I think it's a way the Torah has to get our attention. To say, there are things here that are being combined that just don't go together. But here they do. Right? So here is what Nachmanides, Ramban, had to say about it. He says, in offering these sacrifices, one should realize that he has sinned against his God with his body and soul, and that his blood should be spilled and his body burned, were it not for the loving kindness of the Creator. But it's like this, the sacrifice here is very symbolic, right? You know, it should be me, but that would, I really shouldn't do, I really don't want to do that. You know, it's not worth killing myself over it. So I'm going to make a sacrifice. And God, you should accept that as a penance for my wrongdoing. There's a little bit, you know, kind of Puritan hellfire in this interpretation, right? That, you know, but maybe out of the opposites and out of this, you know, this jamming together of death and life, you get a new kind of person. And, you know, someone who's, you know, recognized how fragile life is, how easy it is to fall into transgression. And maybe that new person won't make the same mistake again. I think that's what Ramban is trying to tell us. Right? Now, his is not the only interpretation here, right? So we have a couple of things from the Talmud to share with you. Rabbi Yishmael argues in the mixture of blood and water into which the living bird is dipped, the blood has to be visible. In other words, this live bird has to be marked with blood. So, you know, it's like the blood, which is the life force, is now on the outside instead of the inside. Right? And what my thought about this is that when we become sick, when we have an illness, we are changed, and the life force eventually becomes obvious on the outside. So there are certain things you can keep inside of you. Some things, the blood becomes visible. Yeah, Dell, you wanted to say something.
And the blood is going to be sprinkled over the, in this case, the house. But if it was a person with the problem, it was going to be sprinkled over the person.
Yes. Yes. So and even if it's not a ritual that applies to a person, the principle applies to the person. So if the message is, this coming together of life and death and the transformation that results from that, we also are transformed by serious illness. Because if that happens to you, what's likely to happen is you're going to change your focus a little bit. You're going to say, okay, well, I don't know how much time I have left, but I better get busy. And so I am more focused on what I have to do with whatever time I have left. Okay? Let me take you to this next piece from the Talmud, and then we'll see the interpretation of Rashi here. Rabbi Eliezer said, always be obscured so that you can endure. Right? In other words, don't put yourself forward too much. Mm-hmm. Rabbi Zera said, we have learned likewise the windows of a dark house may not be opened to examine its tzara'at. This proves it. In other words, as long as you keep a low profile, as long as you don't try to be self-aggrandizing, self-promoting, right, you are much more likely to avoid problems, to avoid, some sort of dis-ease, right? And what does Rashi say about this? Its very darkness is its salvation. As long as the Kohen cannot see it, it's as if it's not there. There can be no tzara'at, affliction in the house with all the consequences, as long as the priest cannot see it. Now, if we were talking about a real disease, I would think you would want to see it. You would want to know so that you could deal with it. Which leads me to believe that maybe Rashi agrees that it's not an actual physical disease, but it's a moral shortcoming. Yes, Ronnie.
That really bothers me, because just because you can't see something does not mean it does not exist.
Yeah, except that but here, all the Rashi is saying is you cannot formally have a diagnosis of tzara'at except by the Kohen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And the Kohen can't just barge in. He has to have a reason. He has to have a report, or he has to be able to see it himself to know that he has to check it out. Right? His job is not to go around inspecting everybody's houses, unannounced. It only happens if someone else sees it or if he sees it.
I interpret it in a much broader sense, not even in relation to what we've been discussing, but just because you don't see a problem does not mean it does not exist.
I understand that, and
Okay.
you know,
Yeah, I see
in-
my son. Okay,
in most circumstances, I would agree with that.
yeah.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Yes, Dale.
Yeah, in today's era with all the plague and such going on, or the COVID stuff,
Well,
Yes.
what we have in the Torah is you examine the
Adam.
situation for evidence of sickness. And if there is evidence of sickness, you deal with the sickness.
Yes.
What we've seen over the whole world, basically, with this COVID stuff is there's no evidence of sickness, but yet we quarantine everybody.
Well, yeah, I mean, there has to be a reason, a rational reason to quarantine. And that is, but, so here the Kohen cannot simply say, well, I'm going to check out everybody or anybody, or I'll do random checks, right?
And once the Kohen checks it out, there has to be some evidence of sickness in order for the quarantining to happen.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. So, understood. Okay. There is, kind of a far-reaching suggestion here about how we're supposed to live. You draw this parallel between the house and the people. And the saving darkness of the house is meant to tell us to, have a certain darkness about our own lives, right? A life that is lived without absolute exposure is spared from being declared impure. Right? Don't expose all your inner workings to public scrutiny. And the point I think here is, we understand nobody is perfect. Everybody has certain failings. Let's call it a dark side, right? You have skeletons in the closet. You have some kind of impurity because you're a human being. And there aren't too many of those who get away without any impurity whatsoever.
And don't air your dirty laundry in public.
But don't show it in public. Don't display those things because, and frankly, every home, if you look hard enough, it's going to have some bacteria. Right? And, maybe some dubious moral issues too, right? And everyone has certain elements that should be left in private rather than brought to broad public attention, right? Again, obviously, if there's someone being harmed or a significant potential for public harm, that's one thing. But just to pour out something about somebody's dark side, it doesn't accomplish anything, right? So, to be completely transparent, and I'll guarantee you, every rabbi is like this too, right? If we were completely transparent and the people hiring us knew everything we had ever done, no rabbi would ever be hired.
Nobody would ever be hired for any position.
Yeah, I mean, because if there's some element of trust, well, there's always something you've done that will make you less trustworthy, right? So yeah, you'd never hire anybody, right? So we have to be just a little bit careful about what we show to the public and what we share with the public about anybody else. All right. I think Ronnie and Jerry have absented themselves. Oh, there's Jerry. You're back.
You're muted, Jerry.
Hello?
Yes, gotcha.
My son's on the phone. Just as an aside, my wife had some surgery today, so
Ah,
is that good? I should tell the world.
Well,
Thank God.
it's, I assume the results are good.
I hope so.
Okay.
well,
So,
good luck.
all
But
right.
yeah, I want to
Well-
ask you. Can I ask one more little question?
Yeah, please.
The Para Duma, and how does that fit into all this we're talking about?
The Para Aduma.
Yeah.
The red cow. Well, that's all the time we have for tonight.
No, I know that's a big subject.
Yes, it is. And we could come to that when we get to that in the Torah in Parshat Chukat.
Right. But
But
that
we will.
part of it too, that was part of the cures.
Yeah, the thing that, makes someone pure can also make the other person impure, and vice versa.
But I think that all kind of fits into what we're talking about, but that's for another lesson.
It's another related issue. Okay, thank you all very much. And we will carry on next week.
Thank you for talking with us.
Hey,
Enjoyed it.
glad to talk with you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Good job.
Ashley, thank you.
Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.